Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Terminology Leading Practices stream of the SNOMED CT Expo 2023. My name is Sarah Warren, and I'm a terminologist at SNOMED International, and I will be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. For online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions into the presenter. For on-site attendees, please use the microphone in the centre of the room. I'm now pleased to introduce Dr. Megan Berry from TermMed, who will be presenting Aligning Local Drug Dictionaries to the SNOMED International Clinical Drug Model, comparison of different strategies and lesson learned. Megan, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm Megan Berry. I'm a doctor and a junior terminologist and medical translator with TermMed. I'll be presenting on behalf of my team. Several of us have been working on this together, and we'd like to share a bit of our experiences with you. So just a brief introduction of who we are. We're TermMed, which is a company which is based in South America, Montevideo in Uruguay. And we've collaborated for many years with the SNOMED International in the development and implementation of the clinical drug model. And then we also support national release centers that maintain clinical drug extensions in our authoring platform, which is TermSpace. This presentation aims to talk a little bit about the lessons that we've learned during this journey and this process. So to get us started, we may want to remember that aligning local medicinal product data stored in national drug dictionaries with a reference terminology has proved to be a significant challenge, requiring different implementation strategies to maximize benefits and cope with legacy data limitations that prevent complete alignment. And so with this in mind, we can say that our objectives overall and for this presentation are to identify challenges to successfully align local data with the SNOMED International Clinical Drug Model, to compare implementation strategies to incrementally overcome those challenges and select the most appropriate one, and also to identify the level of maturity of the alignment of the national SNOMED medicinal product extension and the roadmap to improve that alignment process and to decrease the maintenance cost. So drug data can come from different sources. It could be from the pharmaceutical company, from the knowledge-based provider company, local regulatory authorities, or we can also have data coming from the electronic health record. And we believe that the local drug dictionaries and extensions can bridge that gap. So the SNOMED CT International Clinical Drug Model provides a framework for developing national extensions that will bridge data from local drug dictionaries and the electronic records. So it allows us to bring those together. Before moving on, we are assuming that most of you are familiar with the International Clinical Drug Model. If not, there are useful resources out there. We have a link from a very good tutorial, which was provided by SNOMED International at last year's business meeting and expo. So before we get deeper into this subject, and we want to identify these challenges so that we can then successfully align local data with the international model. And about just a few things about the international model that's important to remember were the major use cases for which it was ideated for. And so those use cases were to facilitate international interoperability of medication concepts, to provide a strong foundation for member countries to develop their national medicinal product terminology, to support medication analytics for research purposes, and to support the development of international medication decision support, such as allergy checking and duplicate therapy checking. Note that e-prescription wasn't at the base there. So before introducing the SNOMED International drug model, the medicinal product hierarchy had many inconsistencies which arrived from different problems, factors, and there were groupers, incomplete logical definitions, ambiguities. And the model introduced improvements, and that helped to generate sufficiently defined logical modeling, allow to validation and extension of coverage, and a flexible class hierarchy that was able to be adapted to different implementation approaches. But the challenges to its adoption by national medicinal product extensions depend on many other factors, such as local resources and the gaps to be covered in the conceptual models, the granularity and the specificity of the local content. So what challenges can arise in trying to bridge these local representations? So the authoritative source of the local information is very diverse. In most situations, the source is the regional or national regulatory authority, but there are cases where e-prescribing projects have their own database and information workflows. The standards and the granularity that is used to represent ingredients, dose forms and units and strengths and real products in the local market is diverse. We've heard this in previous sessions. And sometimes there are significant gaps and inconsistencies that complicate that abstraction to a virtual or a generic higher level class. And fundamentally, the local information and the scenarios might focus on a different use case, which wasn't originally intended by the clinical drug model or the international model. And so some examples of this is that local sources might depend on the concept of a VTM, the virtual therapeutic moiety, that is affected by the implementation of the clinical drug model at the international level. The active ingredients might be specified at the base substance level when the precise substance variant does not have a significant clinical difference. So, for example, virtual or real products that contain amlodipine mesylate might be represented as just having amlodipine in the role of the active ingredient and the base of strength substance. The dose forms and units also might not be aligned with those used in the international model. So considering those challenges, we need to think, what strategies can we implement to overcome those challenges, and which would be the most appropriate one for each situation. So through our experience and over the years and in supporting different projects, we have come up with several possibilities, several options. We're not the only ones, of course, but we can think of a few ways which it could be done, integration options. So there is one which is an intuitive, pure SNOMED CT way. So using their model as it was intended, mapping substances, dose forms, the units of measure and presentation, modeling real product packages based on the market using a national extension model guidance, which is provided, model additional clinical drugs that could be abstracted from real products and complement international coverage, classify, manage equivalencies, and over. But we need to remember that even the best implementations face significant challenges, such as the maintenance burden. Another option is to maintain the principles of the local models that are already implemented and use the clinical drug model as a reference terminology, mapping to it, but preserving and retaining ownership of the local layer. A third option is in the presence of significant gaps to adopt an incremental, iterative approach to improve time to benefit while long-term alignment activities take place in parallel. You could also focus on a minimalistic integration, a bridge, while continuing to support a local priority use case with the existing resources. Or in those cases in which e-prescription and integration with the electronic health record use case is the most significant at the local level, than the regulatory use case, you might consider the adaptation of the clinical drug model, and that needs to be considered, or other use cases together with dispensing. And so that could be covered by the existing local model and the content which has already been implemented. Considering these options, and the different possible integrations that exist, we need to identify the level of maturity of the alignment of a national extension and the roadmap to improve that alignment and decrease the maintenance cost. And that leads us towards our conclusions or our takeaway points, really. We want to consider that we need to select an appropriate level of integration. Attempting a complete alignment when the gap between the two models is significant, it might affect the feasibility of the project and result in significant delays. You might want to consider adopting an incremental iterative approach if it's necessary by implementing higher level bridges to higher clinical drug model classes like MP only or MP only forms. This might require a limited alignment, mapping to substances, mapping from local dose form to higher level forms, insight groupers, use in higher classes, and the counting of ingredients. Some use cases, like e-prescription, were out of scope for the clinical drug model, and so consider continuing the coverage with local resources until a broader consensus is achieved at the international level. We also need to consider maintenance burden and preferred transformation of local information into the SNOMED CT medicinal product extension representations instead of attempting to manually curate the extension. So, in conclusion, really local use case coverage is going to be the key in this integration, because as implementations that are in production and working well may be able to continue while referencing to the clinical drug model instead of fully adopting it. We also might want to consider this incremental alignment. And even if that alignment, full alignment is possible, we need to consider maintenance and the isolation of the local context from the reference terminology evolution. And given that clinical drug classes are sufficiently defined, accommodating granularity challenges like base clinical drugs, e-prescription extensions, and concept model extensions could be achieved in the long term and reconciled with the clinical drug model through reasoner classification. So any questions, we're happy to take them. I'll be accompanied by Guillermo to respond to them.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So just as a reminder, the microphone is in the middle of the room if anyone has any questions they wanted to ask. I'll just have a little look online. Yes, okay, so I use a DM plus D-like model, and my VMPs only specify base ingredients rather than precise ones. They ask what other options.
Yes, that is a problem which is faced by many other extensions around the world who follow a DMD model, or they did, and they're facing similar problems. So Guillermo, maybe you want to take the mic to explain a little bit the steps that we've taken in that case.
Well, the first point is whether you want to preserve the BMPs or not, because you may have the BMPs with your own extension identifiers, and those BMPs may be deeply compromised in electronic health records. So you may prefer to map them to SNOMED clinical drugs rather than computing equivalency and assign or consider them like clinical drugs. That will be the pure SNOMED way. Will be if I find an equivalency between my BMP and the clinical drug, then I use a clinical drug identifier. However, that exposed me to the changes in clinical drugs, inactivations, requirements, and so on. And sometimes the mapping is not complete. So some countries may prefer to preserve the BMP level, and when they try to classify that, they may find that their ingredients that are expressed at the base level of granularity may not classify under the clinical drugs, even if all the other options or the dose forms and the units are identical or are compatible, they may not classify. So this is particularly at the BMP level. If you go to the AMP level, it is the best option is to further specify the ingredient. But at the BMP level, the problem is that sometimes you don't want to further specify it because it is appropriate for the prescription use case in some cases. So the option that we have been considering in this case is to add another layer of clinical drugs that will be a base clinical drug that will be using base ingredients. And obviously, some of them are not appropriate because they have clinical differences in the prescription. But if they are equivalent from the clinical standpoint, you may use them. For example, atorvastatin is a good example. There is no difference between all the presentations in the market are atorvastatin calcium in general. So there is no really a difference. So in that case, we are developing an extension of base clinical drugs. If you add them, they will classify and find their way, and the BMPs will depend on the base clinical drugs, and your AMP will eventually classify under the SNOMED clinical drugs. I think that is one option. The most important question is whether you want to preserve those BMPs or not, because if they are functional to your national strategy for prescription, and you don't want to add detail to the physician and to the prescription workflow, then that's why we think that preserving the local priorities is more important than the full alignment, because we have extensions where the full alignment has been achieved, and then there are some sacrifices. Nothing is cheap. No, there is no free lunch.
Super, thank you. We have another question come through. So what adjustments might I need to consider in the SNOMED International Clinical Drug model? That's what adjustments might I need to consider in the SNOMED International Clinical Drug model?
Well, one of what is a clinical drug? We consider many cases that a clinical drug is a prescribable drug. If it doesn't have the detail enough to be prescribed in generic form, then it is not a clinical drug. Yes, I cannot, prescribe gentamicin 40 milligrams per milliliter. Yes, I have to specify what is the presentation, what is the dose itself, or the size, or the amount of gentamicin, or the volume of the vial, if you want. So for us, the concentration groupers of clinical drugs are too general for prescription. So in some cases, we are adding them as clinical drugs following both concentration strength and concentration strength. So that is one option. And then the other, again, it's all use case based. If you want to cover the prescription use case, that is one of the main reasons some countries are representing their local drug dictionaries as a SNOMED extension, because they get all kinds of benefits from there. In that case, this use case was not in scope for the international drug model. So the first point would be to provide feedback to SNOMED International. So eventually the prescription use case is analyzed and covered. That was one of Megan's points, that perhaps you can start with an iterative approach and incremental while you wait to get consensus about how the model can be further extended, not necessarily in the international release, but at least appropriate guidance about how to extend the model for prescription.
Thank you. Any other questions in the room? Yep, to make your way to the microphone. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm Ruth Lindström. I work with European regulatory agencies a lot, working on IDMP, not so much with SNOMED. One thing that has always puzzled me a little bit about international model is the same that you just said, like we have a clinical terminology, but the drug content is very much manufactured items. It's not administrable products. So if you work with the different national, what do you call it, drug libraries or e-prescription systems, do you see the need for adding administrable products, or what would be the changes that you feel are relevant to make the SNOMED drug content also more like the clinical terminology?
It's a very good question, because we really don't want to choose one word or the other. We want to have both, yes. So currently, we have to choose one or the other. We want to have both the words in a way that are ecologically friendly, that you can maintain both of them. For prescription purposes, I usually prefer to gather consensus through the community and discuss this in the context of international groups to have a more sound approach to this, rather than having an implementation and then say, well, this is my implementation, let's declare that the standard. But in general, we consider that satisfying the requirements to eventually classify under the class level that you prefer for the international class model, it's okay. And then eventually adding additional attributes like a separate, we cannot represent administrable dose forms and pharmaceutical dose forms in the same place. We will have to do it in a separate place. Yes, so one option is to add in a separate axiom additional information. One thing that is quite important in this case is that after you go for a SNOMED extension, you don't always want to just distribute the logical model. You want to distribute everything. There is no point in having to consume a SNOMED extension plus a local drug dictionary. Yes, at the end of the day, the end game is that you would like to contribute to have a single distribution format that is standard. And for that reason, in this meeting this week, there was broad agreement about adopting annotations and additional relationships, so you can almost represent most of the local drug dictionary, including information that may be significant for prescription or for support, decision support. There is a very nice demo from Alejandro Lopez Osornio, demonstrating how to approach this prescription level workflow. So I think that we need to find ways of evolving while having the ability of each country finding their way without, having problems with others. So that's the ecologically friendly part that we propose.
Thank you very much. Unless there's any final questions in the room, no, we'll conclude the session then. Thank you very much, Megan. Online delegates can join another session through the event lobby. Thank you very much.